Madam Clerk.
Oral questions by members.
Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, thank you very much, Honourable Speaker. And first, on behalf of the Official Opposition, I want to congratulate the Premier on her return to the Legislature. I'm sure it's a very, very proud day for her and her family. So my question is to the Premier, and I hope it's a question that we can find some agreement on. The government has chosen to deny funding to women's groups, to Aboriginal groups, to community groups in the downtown east side at the Missing Women's Inquiry. This in spite of the recommendation of Wally Opal, who has recommended that these groups be heard, that their voices be heard at the inquiry. Will the Premier intervene to overturn this decision and make sure those voices are heard at the inquiry?
The Premier of the Province of British Columbia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Leader of the Opposition for his kind remarks to start off this very first question period since I've become Premier. It is indeed nice to be back, and I owe many thanks as well to the people of Vancouver Point Grey for supporting me and getting me here, and of course to all the folks sitting on this side of the House who've been holding down the fort while I haven't been here, including the Minister of Finance and Deputy Premier, who's done some full duties in these last couple of weeks. So I'm delighted to be here, and thank you very much to the member for the question. It is tragic what has happened on the downtown east side, and it continues to be tragic. What happens down there for women and children and men who struggle every day in what is certainly one of Canada's poorest postal codes. It has been a challenge for governments for decades to try and get our hands around the issues down there, try and wrestle them down, and make sure that it's a better place tomorrow than it has been in the past. This government called the inquiry in the first place and appointed Mr. Opal to head it up because we want to make sure that people's voices are heard. And we want to make sure that we get to the bottom of some of the problems down on the downtown east side and make sure that when we get to the bottom of those problems, we have a way to move forward. So I know the inquiry is committed to making sure that we can hear from as many voices as absolutely possible, because we want to make sure that the downtown east side is a better place, is a safer place, and is the kind of close-knit, healthy community that many of the rest of us have the good fortune to live in.
Leader of the Opposition has supplemental.
Well, you know, Honourable Speaker, there's apparently funding for a large number of government lawyers. We've seen in previous matters, in particular in the BC Rail trial, that there's funding sometimes for government insiders, $6 million worth of funding in that case, for them to get access to justice. In this case, we're talking about the groups. And I want to quote the former Attorney General, who says, "These groups are closer to the facts at issue. Most of these groups were frontline lobbyists for public attention to the missing and murdered women, and ultimately for the establishment of a public inquiry." Now, the Attorney General says there's a line, and because of that line, these voices won't be heard at the inquiry. They won't be supported by the government. But I think clearly the government's line is in the wrong place. So what I'm asking the Premier to do is intervene and ensure that those groups that represent women on the downtown east side, are heard at this public inquiry.
Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the member for the question as well. Now, the member knows that the government is funding the families to be able to be heard at the Commission, and we are making sure that as many voices as possible are heard before that Commission. It seems to me to be our obligation to do that, and we're certainly living up to it, although it isn't required by law for us to do that. We want to make sure those voices are heard because, as I said, the issues facing women and children and men who live in the downtown east side are serious and they are urgent. And one of the things the government has done to try and address those issues and make sure that we really understand them, to make sure we have a roadmap to try and address them, is to appoint the Commission of Inquiry that Wally Opal is heading. There are many, many, many other things, though, that we can do. And among them are making it a little bit easier for all families to get ahead in this province. Make it a little bit easier for all those folks, many of whom are struggling at the bottom of the income scale, many of whom find themselves at the middle of the income scale, some of whom still find themselves at risk of homelessness. Make sure that they have a chance to get ahead. Putting families first is at the heart of what we are doing as a government. We want to make sure that families have a lighter burden across the board. It's a little bit easier every day for families to put food on the table for their children, no matter where they find themselves across the province, whether that's in Salmon Arm, whether it's in Prince Rupert, whether it's in Atlin, or whether it's in the downtown east side of the city of Vancouver.
Leader of the Opposition has a further supplemental.
Well, Honourable Speaker, putting families first isn't about words, it's about actions. In this case, the actions are $6 million in funding for the defendants in the BC Rail trial. $6 million, right? That's what it is. And to deny funding to the very groups that Wally Opal has said should be funded. What did he say? He said, Honourable Speaker, he said that the groups that he has given standing at the inquiry should not be denied participation because they have lack of funds, and this is precisely what the government is doing here. The voices who protected and defended women on the downtown east side are being denied access at this hearing. So why doesn't the Premier intervene, give the same status she's giving to government organizations at this inquiry, give the same treatment that the government gave to defendants in the BC Rail trial, and ensure that those voices are heard at this inquiry?
Premier.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thanks again to the member for the question. Now, the member knows, as I said, that the government is funding families. We, I believe, have a moral obligation to do that, even if we don't have a legal one. We certainly are. And we've expanded the terms of reference for the commission so that it's a study commission. They can hear from many other groups as well, so that it's a less formal inquiry, and the idea with that is to make sure that it's easier for people to be able to access the inquiry and make their voices heard. There are very specific issues in the downtown east side that we absolutely have to be thinking about. We have to make sure, as I said, that the route going forward is a lot better than the route going backward that we've seen in the past for people in the downtown east side. But we have to support families all across the province. We have to lighten the burden. That's why the minister responsible for BC Hydro is reviewing BC Hydro. That's why when ICBC decided that they were going to start ticketing people or giving people higher rates after they had one ticket, the Solicitor General stepped in. That's why the Minister for Transportation is having a look at BC Ferries. And that's why we are lowering the HST by 2 points. Hear, hear. We're going to make sure that every family in this province ends up ahead when it comes to taxes. And when you think about the total burden that government puts on families, and want to help families get ahead all across the province, I'd sure rather be supporting a 10% tax than a 12% tax.
Member for Nanaimo.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I'm sure it wasn't the Premier's intention to trivialize this topic by comparing the discussion today with what's happened at ICBC. For years, these women's groups have been arguing and fighting to seek justice. We are talking about dozens of women whose lives are gone, women who have disappeared. It's a very simple proposition. The former Attorney General was very clear. He's a respected jurist. He's a respected lawyer in his time. He was a respected Attorney General. He has stated very clearly that these groups should be funded, so I'm simply asking the Premier to say to me today, to tell this House, to say to this group, why is it okay to pay for $6 million in legal fees for Dave Bazzi and Bobby Vert, but not for these women's groups?
Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Premier has correctly noted, we do feel an obligation to respond to the tragedy that took place in the downtown east side with the murdered and missing women. That's why our government established the inquiry. That's why our government expanded the terms of the inquiry to allow for not just the formal hearing study or hearing commission, but also a study commission, so that all people can participate if they want without the need to rely on lawyers for cross-examination in a more adversarial setting. So we've responded, and in addition, Mr. Speaker, as the Premier noted, we have decided to fund legal representation for the families of the murdered and missing women, because we know that this is an important issue.
Member has supplemental.
I do, Honourable Speaker. If the former Attorney General, the head of this commission, had thought the funding was adequate to simply fund one lawyer to represent all of the families, he would have said so. But that's not what Mr. Opal said. He said, and I quote, "My intention was to ensure that no group withstanding before the inquiry would be denied legal counsel at the evidentiary hearings due to lack of funds." The simple fact is, no one goes into this kind of inquiry without counsel and expects to get the same hearing or have the same kind of job done. Businesses don't go into courtrooms without high-priced lawyers because they appreciate you need an advocate. The fact is the former Attorney General recognized the need for advocates for these groups to ensure that all the voices were heard. So again, my question to the Premier is, why is it we can fund Bobby Verk and Dave Bazzi, but we can't fund these groups?
Attorney.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Obviously, the public, as well as the government, and I would assume the opposition from the comments I've just heard, has a limited appetite for spending unending amounts of money on lawyers and their fees. That's why, Mr. Speaker, we've decided to prioritize. And our priority is putting families first. And like we did for the Braidwood inquiry, looking at the tragic death of Robert Chikansky, where we provided funding for the family of Mr. Chikansky to be represented in that inquiry, we're providing funding for the families of the murdered and missing women that sadly lost their lives in the downtown east side at the hands of Mr. Picton. Mr. Speaker, there is not an unlimited amount of money that can be spent on taxpayers' fees. Our government recognizes that, but nevertheless we are providing the funds necessary so that the families of the murdered and missing women have legal representation at the inquiry.
Vancouver Mount Pleasant.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Some 60 women have gone missing from the downtown east side community, and 20 other women have gone missing from the Highway of Tears since 1995. Wally Opal, on May 3rd, 2011, the inquiry commissioner recommended that the government provide funding to 13 applicants who requested financial assistance to participate in the formal hearing of the commission. For this inquiry to deliver real answers and lessons, residents of the downtown east side, women's and indigenous advocacy and service organizations must be full participants. They were close to the women who have gone missing. They knew their struggles and they knew their lives. And they are the ones who drew public attention, Mr. Speaker, to these cases and have been fighting for justice. So my question is to the Premier. Will she support their participation in the inquiry so that BC has a meaningful and full missing women's inquiry?
Attorney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I indicated, our government is providing funding for legal representation for the families of their murdered and missing women so that they can participate in the formal inquiry component that's taking place. But as I mentioned, Mr. Speaker, our government responded to a request from the Commissioner himself in March to expand the terms of reference so it would allow for a study commission, which is less formal, less adversarial, more open for people to participate with or without legal representation. So that avenue is there, and I know that the Commissioner does intend to hold study commission hearings and to make it as accessible as possible for people to participate.
Member has supplemental.
Yes, I do, Mr. Speaker. Let me just put this quote on the record. This inquiry has a responsibility to highlight those systemic injustices that allow the unimaginable deaths and disappearances of so many women from the downtown east side. The membership of organizations and groups like the Downtown East Side Women's Center and February 14th Women's Memorial March Committee provide the critical context necessary for this inquiry as we knew the women and their lives. Without their participation, the inquiry will be incomplete. Many fear that it will become an exercise that generates no real answers or lessons. This inquiry is not just about understanding what happened, Mr. Speaker. It is also about preventing more cases of women going missing from the downtown east side and other parts of British Columbia. Will the Premier reconsider? Will the Premier do the right thing and allocate legal funding to support these organizations so that they have full voice and full participation at this inquiry?
Attorney.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. In addition to what I've already stated about the informal study commission component that our government recently added to the terms of reference for the commission of inquiry, last week Commissioner Opal was quoted on May 26th as stating that people at the study commission don't need to cross-examine witnesses, Mr. Speaker. That's confirmation that in order to participate in the hearing, you don't need to have a taxpayer-funded lawyer. Now, we did see fit to provide legal representation for the families of the murdered and missing women. We felt that that was appropriate. It's similar to what government's done with other inquiries, such as the Braidwood inquiry into what happened to Mr. Chikansky when he arrived at YVR, the International Arrivals Lounge. But Mr. Speaker, as the Premier pointed out, she's quite correct. We have no legal obligation to do that, but we felt it is important to do it for the families, and that's why we are funding representation for the families.
For Surrey Wally.
Thank you. My question, too, is for the Premier. Clearly, Mr. Justice Opal, as he was, and former Attorney General, did not make this recommendation lightly. It came after careful consideration and submissions by the Commission, and he's recommended that in order that justice be done, and I'm going to quote from what he said, "My recommendation to the provincial government was to fund all the groups that satisfied me that they would not be able to participate fully without financial support." So this is coming from a very respected jurist, a former Attorney General, who did not make this recommendation lightly. So why will the Premier not heed that advice and overrule the Attorney General?
Attorney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Commissioner will be pleased to know that the opposition, who used to criticize him on a daily basis, now considers him well respected. I'm sure he'll appreciate that change of heart on the part of the NDP. But, Mr. Speaker, again, as I've said, our government is putting families first. There is a limited amount of money and a limited amount of taxpayer appetite, frankly, for spending money on lawyers and their fees. And so we have decided to prioritize funding for legal representation for the families of the murdered and missing women. And that's similar to what government has done with previous inquiries, such as the Braidwood inquiry that I've already talked about, where we provided funding for the mother of Mr. Chikansky, but not for other groups that wanted to participate. There are other people seeking funding, but the government decided to put the funding for the families first.
The member has supplemental.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do. Well, that limited appetite wasn't much in evidence when the government approved $6 million in legal fees for Bobby Burke and Dave Bassey. Once again, I return to what Mr. Justice Opal said. My intention was to ensure that no group was standing before the inquiry would be denied legal counsel at the evidentiary hearings due to lack of funds. Again, for the evidentiary hearing, a considered response by the former Attorney General. Will the Premier intervene and overrule this Attorney General and fund those groups?
Attorney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Premier noted, we are all tragically touched by what happened on the downtown east side and the loss of all those lives in such a senseless, tragic, and frankly horrific way. That's why we're pleased to see a conviction entered and the sentence imposed upon Mr. Picton. But we didn't want to stop there. That's why our government appointed an inquiry of commission to look into whether there were systemic issues that prevented Mr. Picton's arrest at an earlier date and his earlier conviction. And so we're funding the commission of inquiry. We've expanded the terms of commission, reference for the inquiry, so that people can participate in the study commission without the need for taxpayer-funded lawyers. And so they can do that in a less adversarial way, but still have their voices heard. And in addition, Mr. Speaker, because we are so touched by what happened and so distraught, we have made funds available to provide legal representation for the families of the murdered and missing women.
Member Victoria Beacon Hill.
Mr. Speaker, this is the government's own commissioner, appointed by the government, appointed by the government to manage a very serious issue of missing women across this province. The commissioner himself has recommended to government that these groups and organizations need to be funded in order to participate in this very serious inquiry. I heard the Attorney General, Mr. Speaker, say that it's about priorities, that we have to prioritize money. Well, it's very clear where the BC Liberals have made a priority. Their friends and insiders, Bessie Vert, got $6 million and nothing for the Missing Women's Inquiry. So my question is to the Premier. If the Premier wishes, through you, Mr. Speaker, to put families first, here is an opportunity. Fund the groups and organizations today.
The Premier of British Columbia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the member for her question. I'm very glad that the rumors of her imminent demise are turning out to be untrue. She's provided a great voice for women in British Columbia. We haven't always agreed on everything, but I'm delighted that she's continuing her seat in the legislature, continuing to take her seat in the legislature. As the Attorney General has said, our government is deeply concerned about what's happened to the downtown east side, and that was why we appointed the Commission of Inquiry in the first place. That was why we took Justice Opal's advice and expanded the terms of reference so that it could be a study commission and hear from more people, and that's why we are providing funding for the families to be heard in this, so that they can be represented by lawyers, just like we did in the Braidwood inquiry. So the government is, I think, with all of these actions, demonstrating in this aspect, in this particular aspect, that we do really, this is an incredibly important issue. We have to make sure we get to the bottom of it. And we have to make sure that going forward, the downtown east side is a safer place in the future than it has been in the past. Our government remains deeply concerned about this, not just with respect to the work of this inquiry, but even further. We need to, as I said, look at the total burden on families overall. We need to make sure that low-income families in particular are doing better than they have been. That's why our government has provided a whole series of rebates and made it a whole lot easier to be able to support the burden of government when you're at low income now than it was about 10 years ago.
Here. The member has supplemental.
I do, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I remind the Premier that we're talking about the Missing Women's Inquiry. And the Missing Women's Inquiry would not have happened if it wasn't for those 13 groups who stood up to this government to insist on having the inquiry. Mr. Speaker, these are groups and organizations who put time, who put energy, who put their own resources into making sure that inquiry was going to be there, in making sure that they would have a voice to try and do everything possible to ensure that these kinds of things don't happen again. And now, Mr. Speaker, when they're asking for funding to fully participate, this government has said no. So I ask my question again to the Premier. Why won't the Premier, why won't the BC Liberals support these groups and organizations, support the work that they've done to get the inquiry so they can fully participate?
Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the former Leader of the Opposition, many thanks again for the question. This government, although I was on the outside at the time, I'm reliably informed, and I remember this from my days in radio. The government said at the time that they would support an inquiry when the legal proceedings were complete. And the government kept their promise and has gone further, has accepted the recommendation of Commissioner Opal to expand the terms of reference to make it a study commission so that more people can be heard, and has gone and followed the example that was set in the Braidwood inquiry and made it possible for the families to be funded and be heard at the inquiry. I think those are very important steps to have taken, and it really reflects, more than anything, this government's deep concern about the conditions in the downtown east side. All of those missing and murdered women were lost to their families and to our communities in the most tragic way possible. It's incumbent on all of us, in every aspect, in every corner of our society in British Columbia, to care and to show that we care by doing something about it. And that's what this government has done.
Member for Port Coquitlam.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. My question is to the Premier. This is not about the HST. This is about missing women, women who were murdered at the Picton farm. It's about a botched investigation. It's about mistakes that were made and should never happen again. That's what this inquiry is about. It's not about the HST. The individual heading up that inquiry, a former Attorney General of this province, whom, though we often disagreed with, always respected, has said that these 13 groups should be funded. Those 13 groups know more about the downtown east side than the Premier and her entire government will ever know. So my question is to the Premier. Why doesn't she give the former Attorney General, Wally Opal, what he's been asking for, that funding be provided for these 13 groups so that we can get a report that really does accomplish something?
Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll say it again. Our government was very touched by what happened. We watched closely and we helped fund the investigation as it took place. Prosecutions were pursued, convictions were obtained, and a sentence was imposed. So Mr. Picton, I don't think will be seeing the light of day anytime soon, and that's appropriate. However, Mr. Speaker, we didn't stop there. We felt it was important to establish an inquiry to look into whether, in fact, there was a botched investigation. The member has reached his conclusions. I'm interested in hearing the conclusions of the Commission in that regard, and that's why we established it. And we are providing funding so that the families of the murdered and missing women can directly participate with legal representation in the formal inquiry and also in the study commission as well, which is the less formal hearings. My understanding is that Commissioner Opal is hoping to start those less formal hearings within weeks, and will be traveling to northern British Columbia to do so.
Member of supplemental.
Yes, Honourable Speaker. Commissioner Opal knows what he's doing. He asked for funding for a reason. When the Premier has been asked about this funding, she's talked about wanting to make things better, and she's talked about the HST. This is not about the HST. This is about missing and murdered women from the downtown east side, and a commissioner, a former Attorney General, who is recommending funding for 13 groups. Why will the Premier not listen to the commissioner, the former Attorney General of this province, who's recommended the funding for those 13 groups? Why will the Premier not fund those groups?
Attorney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've heard the opposition complain day after day about how much money has been spent in the past on legal fees, and our government actually shares many of those concerns. It's why I've appointed Stephen Toop, the President and former President of UBC and former Dean of Law at McGill University, to review the indemnity policy, to get a better handle on legal fees through the indemnity policy in the future. But unfortunately, we can't turn the clock back. We can't put a different date stamp on a memo and set the clock back on that issue. What we can do is get a better handle on expenses in the future, and that will give us more resources in the future to spend on things like providing representation for families in public inquiries. And in this public inquiry, Mr. Speaker, our government is funding the families.
Member for Nelson Creston.
Mr. Speaker, 13 organizations have put their hearts and souls into the downtown east side. It is because of them that we have this inquiry. They have been strong advocates for their communities. They need to be heard at this public inquiry. They need to have the funding necessary to do so. Will the Attorney General today commit to that funding? It's a simple question, and they need an answer.
Attorney.
Mr. Speaker, the member is incorrect. The reason for the public inquiry is because of the families of their murdered and missing women. It's because our government, like everybody in British Columbia, and frankly anybody in the world that heard about this case, was horrified about what happened. And we want to find out if there's lessons that we can learn so we can prevent something like this from happening in the future. That's why we appointed the formal inquiry. That's why we've expanded the terms of reference as requested by Commissioner Opal. And it's why we're providing legal representation for the families of the murdered and missing women. And I want to get the results as soon as possible so that if there are lessons to learn, if there are policies and procedures between the police forces that need to be changed, I want that information as quickly as possible so we can make improvements in the future and stop something like this from happening again.
Bell ends question period.